Something like this is where eventually it leads, because I like looking at history and reading back in the history books, going back into what is considered the Robinhood myths. That was all based around food in the 1600s during the Maunder Minimum. It's incredibly interesting how food was the focal point, and the morals had changed and bent to allow poor to steal food from the rich.
Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying grand solar minimum, and the media overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output, but very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time: cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather patterns as our magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the Grand Solar Minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David DuByne.
Tonight, we're going to talk about crop losses because of the early cold in autumn. Those were expected, as we all heard during Grand Solar Minimum. IPCC, global warming, that was to not be expected, but now they've switched the narrative several times, as you've seen in the news over the last couple of years. But here we go. Remember these incredibly early snows in Japan, all-time record, earliest snow ever recorded in the last 300 years on Hokkaido Island back on the 18th of August. The snows through Europe, the snows across Canada, the frost that decimated, 3 million acres so far in Canadian agriculture due to cold. Now we have these blizzards in the southern hemisphere. Australia, all-time record cold, snapping hundreds and hundreds of records. Power lines down, excessive snowstorms, but that's down in the southern hemisphere. And as we come into winter, we had these incredible, cold events coming across the northern hemisphere, and the media has just been waiting. So I encourage you to do some of your own research and look back to see what some of these cold weather events occurred over this last month. It is incredible what has happened with the amount of underreporting of some of these events that are affecting our crops. The amount of crops that have been lost is absolutely astounding. It covered everything from the canola crop to wheat, oats, barley, and everything in between. And it really was kind of a shame, because after the really rough season to plant in the beginning of the year due to excessive cold that strung out really late into the springtime, excessive wet, it was really wet, there was flooding, still snow on the ground. You remember they were tilling the snow to try to allow sunlight to hit the soil and actually warm up the soil more to allow the snow to melt faster. So they were out there tilling fields, not to actually till to plant, but to till to break the snow so the albedo would be broken. What's the cost driver on that for the farmers? They're not going to pass that fuel cost along to you so they can plant their crops. They're just going to have to eat that cost. Also, word is, I've been getting an enormous amount of these same reports over and over and over again. It's the third year that they're experiencing losses. With this, the traditional banking system will no longer finance them. So a lot of these farmers are now turning to, shall we say, loan sharks, secondary loan markets, because they cannot get traditional credit through the banking system due to the third year of losses. Where is this going to take us in the future? As we do move, are more and more farmers going to experience the same thing? If they are, then what happens with that whole finance mechanism to get them the seeds to plant? We're really getting into the very edge of these losses here that I was talking about. Myself, Ice Age farmer, Christian, Diamond Oppenheimer Ranch, suspicious observers. And Christopher over there at Ice Age 2050, the climate guy, there's so many people following this at the moment. Everybody's been pointing to the same thing. These losses are starting to mount up. But again, there's an opportunity in here, but you just have to know what's happening. So let's cover a few of the, shall we say, frost events. I'm going to start down here, shivering through coldest night, records being shattered across Australia, cold records, as a matter of fact. And then somebody sent me this really incredible article off The Guardian, impressive food heists. So I thought, all right, what are people starting to steal already? What are the number one targets that are being, taken out of the warehouses, stolen off trucks right now? So this is over the last 12 months through Europe, specifically Europe. So what's happening with the corn and what's happening with the wheat is one thing, but people aren't out there stealing an entire truck of 20 tons of wheat. Not happening yet. But if we go back to the 1600s, the Army had to accompany every single grain shipment at that time due to road bandits. Now, this is where some of the lore and the folklore and the tales of Robinhood, etc., stealing from the rich to give to the poor, that's because the rich controlled the food production. People were starving, and it was considered and deemed morally okay to steal to go ahead and feed your family. So this is kind of where you look back in history and you start to see, Ring Around the Posy, 1300s with the Black Death, and you start to see all these, what were considered lore, folklore, and the reasoning behind it. But not stealing entire grain shipments. That we're not even close to that yet. But let's see where we are. Number one thing that people are stealing at the moment out of warehouses and trucks, Nutella. I was shocked, actually, at Nutella being the number one insured after being stolen, thieved item. And Germany leads this with 13,600 jars of Nutella just stolen in April. And then they have a rundown of 6,800 jars, 5,000 jars, 3,000 jars, etc. So they're showing where the amount of these jars or the heists, the food heists, have been inside Germany leading this. So Nutella, that makes the top of the list here. Interesting. Number two most pilfered item, that's food, cheese. Believe it or not, the vacuum packed cheese, cheddar being the number one stolen type of item out of there. Look at this. Just in the UK alone, 4.9 million pounds worth of cheese was stolen just last year. That's interesting. Oh, here we go. Number 3, maple syrup. Now, see, some of these things, I look at this and that makes no sense. Why would people be out there stealing maple syrup? Well, when you start to think about this thing's rising to $17, $18, $19 per bottle, well, you can see what that happens. Canada's Great Train Robbery. Thieves stole 12.5 million pounds worth of maple syrup from a storage facility. So that's kind of one of the bigger food capers. Walnuts leading next down the list. And then fine dining, something called dining and dashing, a dine and dash, if you will. People run in, they rack up a bill, $500, $600, whatever it might be, $100, and then they run. They'll say, "Oh, I need to use the restroom," and then they get out and take off. So this seems to be a new kind of fad, if you will, dining and dashing. So you start to see it already happening everywhere you look. So here we go. Next one down the list, chocolate. I guess chocolate's kind of easy to steal. It's small. You can put it right in your pocket. But I never would have guessed. Further down the line, caviar. Delicacy of food choice around in Russia. This is the most stolen food product in Russia, caviar. Also through Europe. So this stays right in that same general vicinity. I don't know how much caviar would be stolen in the States or Africa, but for sure in Europe and Russia, this is the number one stolen item there. All right, next on the list, honey. Again, honey is becoming very expensive, not only to the neonicotinoids that are killing off the bees, but just in general, quality honey is costing more money. And you start to see that across the board. Anything with quality in it that's not chock full of preservatives and just GMO and all these things, you're going to have to pay more money for this. So here they are, people stealing honey. Now, some of this Manuka honey apparently is at $50 per jar in the Tesco supermarkets. So now they have to put a special RFID chip, and they have a guard to watch the Manuka honey section. Well, that's interesting. Like, how much extra must they pay to do that? Next on our line, obvious, meat. This is a worldwide thing here, but the number one highest dollar value of meat stolen through this year was 100,000 pounds worth of beef from a processing facility. They never caught the persons either. Oh, next on tomatoes. Now that is really interesting. Tomatoes. A heist of $300,000. They stole an entire truckload full of tomatoes, and included in this would be cucumbers. Mexico and North America lead the tomato thefts. So depending on where you are living globally, you can see the types of items that people are already getting into stealing. Now, some of these are higher priced items, so this goes right along with when food becomes more expensive and people cannot afford it, they're going to start stealing it. And again, Nutella, I'm not sure how much that costs. I'm not a Nutella fan. Cheese, I know, is quite expensive depending on where you live. Maple syrup's incredibly expensive. Walnuts, that's a high dollar. Not even almonds and pistachios, those types. People running without paying their bills. Chocolate's expensive. Caviar, of course. And the honey, different types of prized meats. And then these vegetables are now being stolen. Just switch that into a grand solar minimum and scale it out onto the planet. We could start to get a sort of layover on what is going to happen as food prices rise. Now, that rundown of the 10 impressive food heists by class of food and by continent was a pretty interesting read in itself, the most stolen foods. All right, great. It's at the expensive edge of things now, but how much further does it have to go down before people start coming in and stealing a box of cornflakes or going in and stealing a tin of oats off of the shelf? Something like this is where eventually it leads, because I like looking at history and reading back in the history books, going back into what is considered the Robinhood myths. That was all based around food in the 1600s during the Maunder Minimum. It's incredibly interesting how food was the focal point, and the morals had changed and bent to allow poor to steal food from the rich. Now that was a society accepted norm bend at that time. So here we are, we're starting to see it. Now, you think about it, if you caught these people stealing Nutella or honey, and they told you, oh, it's too expensive, I can't afford it, I can barely afford to eat or even buy beans, what will society start to think about that? Okay, it's a couple bad actors or bad apples at the moment coming in stealing from supermarkets, but what if it becomes more the norm than it is the exception, where like 50% of the people are doing it, or even 20%? How will society's perceptions of food theft change as prices rise? There's going to have to be a shift somewhere along the line. Will it be sympathy? Will it be anger? Will it be animosity? Frustration? What kind of feelings will it be? Because there's not going to be celebration like, yay, everybody's stealing, we can all steal, and then food's going to be more expensive because everybody's stealing and the insurance costs. Anyway, it's something to think about in a mind experiment moving forward as we get into greater and greater losses. So I had a few articles ready here for you. I'm going to take you over to Myanmar for a second. Minbu in Myanmar. This is a mud volcano that has awoken and is now currently at a point of eruptive activity where the monks are going there with flowers and milk to try to drop it into the bubbles as they arise from the white mud. Now, this is considered the dragon's breath in this area. And, it has been silent and dormant. The activity off of Minbu has been incredibly low for the last 100 to 150 years, according to the persons that live there locally. But Minbu has just awoken. Now, this is a remnant of a volcano. It's a mud volcano off of the chain that's running along Tenchong on the China border there. That was an active volcano not too long ago. Some of these volcanoes inside Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, have not been active for 4,500 years. Enter Minbu. Now, it has spooked people so much over there that the monks, like I said, they're in there blessing this mud pit, and it's white mud, which is really interesting because most times you're not really getting a white mud. It looks like white chalk, and it's spelled Minbu, Minbu. It's in the central part of Myanmar. So every time a large bubble erupts and the methane comes out of it, the monks pour milk into there because it's white mud, and they pour the milk, and they're trying to appease the dragon under the earth. Now, this is expected with an uptick in volcanic activity as we come into this grand solar minimum. This is well known, the correlation between volcanic activity and decreases in output from the sun. Fine. But here's another one that is a pretty much geologically inactive spot on the planet that's now coming and starting to rumble back to life.
And since I have been talking about our need moving forward in this new society that we're entering, as our global grain production starts to be reduced in yield, your food prices are going to skyrocket. And I mean skyrocket, not just doubling or tripling, something like 5 or 10 times higher by 2020 at the very least. TrueLeafMarket.com. I really want to talk about growing your own food, which will be a necessity moving forward. They've been around since 1974, heirloom and organic seeds. Since I've started talking about them in my videos, I have a lot of people write and say that they've previously ordered, that they know the owner, having great results, good customer service. They quite enjoyed the seed quality as well. And there's so many ways that we can go about growing different types of vegetables that we're going to need. Microgreens are incredibly nutritious. They're super fast to grow. In less than a week, you can have something that you can eat. And we know the benefits of microgreens. All you have to do is use a search engine and look up vitamin, mineral, nutrient content of microgreens. You'll be shocked. Also, sprouts. We can get those a little bit taller, a little more dense, a little bit larger volume on the vegetation mass coming off of there. So how do you know what kind of sprouts to grow? How about wheatgrass or herbs? What about different types of herbs that we can add to our foods? Now, what I just described to you, there's a full range of starter guides there at TrueLeafMarket.com for you to take a look at. Even if it's just for your own knowledge and you don't purchase something from them, at least get the information so you know how to grow microgreens, you know how to grow sprouts, you understand what some of the herbs are for. And not only that, they have wheatgrass and grain seeds. So when I'm talking about grain growing regions going offline, we just need to look back in history and see where across the planet there was difficulty growing grains when this grand solar minimum intensified and the jet stream started wandering just like they're doing today, due to a decreased magnetosphere that does not hold our jet streams locked in their traditional flows. Grains are one thing, herb seeds are another, cover crops, something different, but whatever you do, organic seeds are going to be a necessity because you can save those seeds and then grow them the next season, which you unequivocally cannot do with GMO. TrueLeafMarket.com. Use the link below and give yourself the gift of organic and heirloom seeds.
Also, the locals have taken great interest in putting flowers around the rim of this. It's starting to bubble over the crater rim, if you will. The crater rim itself is becoming larger, and the locals just keep coming out in droves to try to appease this thing because last time, apparently, this is the lore, the last time that the dragon awoke, there was a great famine. So, what is this telling us going back in history about, the legends, the stories? How would you pass down such knowledge from hundreds or thousands of years so it would stay intact as a belief system in the culture? Start to look at these things. They're talking about dragon's breath. And plus, also, firsthand accounts with some of my friends in Myanmar when I was following this Minbu story. The amount of rain that has come down there is literally once in a 200-year event. It has rained and flooded areas that they didn't know could be flooded. That's how much rain has come down there. Now, normally, the southern areas where the rice is grown, it floods every year. It's part of the flood basin. It's supposed to flood. But they're having areas up in the rubber plantations that are flooding that have never been known to flood before. Now, again, when we talk about never been known to flood, we're talking since the British occupation in circa, say, 1870 or so. This is kind of when the records really were kept, and the flood marks, and the British were pretty meticulous about keeping records at that time. But when they say that, they're going back at least 5 to 6 generations coming back in. Well, nobody knew about flooding in this area here. Well, I bet there were floods previously, but they were just on longer duration cycles. So Minbu and massive floods across Myanmar. They've also lost an enormous amount of crops down there. So if you want to add the Philippines in for crop losses, and then you can add in Myanmar, which is or was the breadbasket of Asia. They've really revamped their agriculture, and they are on par to become a major exporter again of rice in and around Asia. But the crop losses have just taken them out as well. So they are going to be looking for imports themselves this year because they just have lost so much of their arable land due to massive floods. Fiji, not a place that we would suspect would have too much of an influence or culture on drought. But Fiji, again, these are microcosm areas that produce and feed their own local populations. Fijian Islands, they have some of their own indigenous agriculture where they feed, and they use that local agriculture to feed local consumption. Well, what happens? They have a massive drought going on in Fiji, and farmers are reporting drastically reduced harvests, severe water cuts. So Fiji would be another perfect example. Now, where are they going to get that food from? They're going to import it. It's still available on the planet somewhere. We're not to that point of shortages yet. But how much extra will it cost the Fijian people to buy and import that food? And what percentage of that total is going to take out of their income that they would spend on other things on the island? Or islands, plural. What are they going to stop spending on first? They have to buy more expensive food. What, 20, 30% more expensive? Fijian Islands, man, that's way out there. They're really, to try to get something sent and shipped over is going to be pricey. So what do you think they would stop spending on first? Now, let's go out to the Fijian Islands for a second. Holiday destination, surfing destination. Most people flying in there, they just go in to enjoy themselves. But you have people that live there day to day. Now, what are they going to stop spending on if their food rises 20 or 30%? Now, these are smaller economies. Will they have a ripple effect into the total greater global economy? Probably not. They could have some regional effect, obviously. Specific products, absolutely. What are those? I don't know the supply chain into the country. But when we start to look out into wider time frames coming into 2021 or 2022, we're going to start to see this on a global level where food is going to rise. And everywhere you look now, you're starting to see, I don't know, there's losses everywhere happening at different variances and different amounts, different percentages across the planet and countries. And Australia has lost pretty much everything down there at the moment on the southeast part of the continent, where they're growing wheat. They don't know how much harvest. This last record cold freeze just a few days ago has wiped out whatever was left out there. We'll take a look at the numbers. They were predicted to be down, half, 50% of what they were last year. That was in the preliminary forecast from the USDA. And if you take a look back just 4 years ago, Australia is down 75% from what they were 4 years ago. They're only predicted to be pushing maybe 3 million metric tons, and they were almost at 12 million metric tons a few years back. So their total production inside Australia is down 75%, but it's not making news. They keep talking about, they're going to push this many millions of tons. But they forget to tell you, look back a few years and see what it was from the total. See, the news will rephrase it as, they had more than last year. And the news, mainstream media, corporate media is very good at rephrasing things to make it look more rosy than it really is. This is part of the smoke and mirrors deflection campaign. They want you to look left, you need to be looking right. But now we're seeing severe hailstorms. We should see that in the spring in the northern hemisphere, not in the autumn going into what would be the winter season. So here we go, northern Kashmir itself, northern India, severe hailstorm, and also other parts of Himachal Pradesh with the apples being wiped out earlier in the year. They were talking about How much extra is it going to cost to put hail netting over all the orchards? This is the second year in a row this has happened in these same areas in the Himalayan basin. So think about that. These apple farmers, apple orchard owners, they're going to have to put in hail netting out to protect the crops. And we saw that also in Australia. They're talking about how to bring things indoor to be able to protect it. Now, if you start to add all these things up, you're going to see a little bit over here, a little bit over here, and the progression just keeps going to a lot bit over there, more bit over there, and you can see how the snowball is starting to roll down the hill. I'm going to continue right through the substitution and the switch of crops or suppliers here. And this one's coming off the Business News Wire. The Australian drought and the minimal output is now leaving Asian buyers to turn to Argentina for wheat. Australia has lowered its wheat forecast from even the low forecast another 13% this week. So the Asian buyers are now turning to Argentina. And the whole trade war going on with the soybeans between the United States and China, that will explain away a lot of the food price rises inside China to the local Chinese people there, the citizens of China. There's a trade war going on. Expect the food price to go up. Deal with it. Don't complain. And just go about your day. Easy explanation. Absolutely. So if the Asians are already turning to Argentina for wheat, you got to realize Asia has almost 3 billion people of the 8 that are on the planet. If they're already going to secondary suppliers because the main suppliers are not able to supply them their needs any longer, we have definitely turned a corner right now. It's kind of a spooky headline to read if you think about it, because Australia cannot provide enough wheat for Asia anymore. Who's next? Well, let's just look within Asia and see who's not supplying wheat, because they're in absolute drought. Then we go to Kazakhstan. That's a goodie. Northern China, Heilongjiang. North Korea, they can't feed themselves. They're in a massive drought. Okay, these are some kind of bigger players in Asia. China is no longer exporting wheat this year. They're going to be 100% net importer. Who else is also going to flip from any type of exports into 100% imports? USDA was talking about how tight the amount of wheat is globally at the moment. I think of the total amount of supply. Let's say there's 100% of supply. There's 700 million tons out there. Let's say that's the total amount, 700 million tons. Only 25% of that's actually going to be for export anywhere on the planet. The other 75% is going to be not for export, locked in the countries that are producing. Now, generally, that's 50% or above. Generally, more than half's out there for sale, exports flowing around the planet at any one time. But if you're looking at that, it's below 25 or 25%. It was 27% a couple of weeks ago. Now it's 25%. And these new headlines coming out where now Asian buyers are looking over to South America for help to get their supplies. Now, what if they can't get the wheat? What are they going to switch to? See, that's the thing. There's an enormous amount of soybeans and corn this year because the conditions for growing between this wheat and oats wipeout have been a bumper for the soybean and the corn. So if they can't get the wheat, will they buy corn? Will their customers accept corn instead of wheat products? Will they accept cornbread instead of wheat bread? I don't know. To be announced, I guess. At this point, it may be a price point. Who knows?
This video is brought to you by our friends at TrueLeafMarket.com. Heirloom and organic seeds for any grow zone on our planet.